Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with Diligent on the subject of crisis management and the board of directors. My name is Holly Groom, and I'm Field Marketing Manager for the UK and Ireland here at Diligent. And today I'm joined by my colleague Nathan Birtle, who's a VP of Sales and Business Development, also in the EMEA office. Before we get started today, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar will last approximately 30 minutes long. We will do our best to give you a couple of minutes back at the end if we can. We are recording today's webinar, and we will send a copy of this recording to you in the next 24 hours. So you can feel free to forward this along to any of your colleagues or board members who may not have been able to join us today. If you'd like to ask questions during today's webinar, you can do so at any time via the Ask a Question pane on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can during today's session, and anything that we don't have time for, we will come back to you via email after the webinar. And finally, we do have a quick poll today, so we would very much appreciate if you could participate in that one with us. And with that, I'm going to pass you over to Nathan.
Thank you, Holly. The topics for discussion today you can see in front of you on the screen. We're going to cover four areas: crisis management itself, a brief definition of what that means, and some examples of crises and how they were well managed or not. Examples of communication infrastructure that are vital to support the decision-making process that boards and executive teams go through in times of crisis. Specifically, how board portals and equivalent technology can help in setting up an effective communication infrastructure. And as part of that, we'll also show you a brief demonstration of some of the technologies that are available today to support this process. And as Holly mentioned, if we have time at the end, we will make time for Q&A for any questions that you may have using the panel on the side of the GoToMeeting screen. So what you see in front of you now is a definition of crisis management, i.e. the process by which an organization can deal with a major event that threatens to harm that organization, its stakeholders, or the general public. And it's very interesting to note that where organizations handle crises well and they have demonstrate strong, decisive leadership, often the image of that organization can come out more strongly than it did at the start or during the crisis itself. The corollary of that is that poor management can often give a larger impact on the organization than the original crisis itself. And there's a few examples of this that we'll look at as we go through. Now we're going to come up to the first poll in a moment, because one of the most important aspects for an organization to be able to effectively deal with a crisis and manage a crisis is the communications infrastructure that's being used for sharing information across the executive team. So what we'll do now is open up an audience poll, and if you can answer one of the responses according to what's appropriate for your organization as to the way that you communicate board documents currently. So there are 5 options there. They include printing and distributing via a courier. Maybe you send documents in PDF format and distribute them via email. Alternatively, you may use Dropbox or some other file sharing solution. Some organizations have in-house tools that they've developed specifically for this sort of purpose. Or finally, the option for using a board portal such as the technology provided by Diligent. We'll pause for a moment or two while people answer that question, and Holly will close the vote in a moment. And what we see as a result of the poll is that, interestingly, we have a large number of the audience who are using a board portal. So we're very grateful for that. Hopefully a number of those are Diligent users. Quite a few distribute documents via email in PDF format, some printing via paper and courier, and a few with custom in-house tools. That sort of response is not unusual. In fact, I'd say that probably more using board portal than we've had in other webinars. It would typically be more 25% print, sort of 50% PDF and email, and 25% board portal, I think, in other series that we've done. But we'll go through during the session looking at where some of these technologies are more effective than others, and also some of the more recent enhancements that have been made to support the effective communication for boards in times of crisis. So thank you for participating in that. Let's look at some examples of crises and what we mean by that right now. I'm not going to go through each of these in turn. Clearly, I'm sure everyone can think of some examples of financial crises that have occurred over the last few years that impact organizations. In the area of cybersecurity, there have been many, all too many actually. Recently, the NHS WannaCry affected that organisation and many others as well. Similarly, we've had hacking scandals at places like TalkTalk that impacted the organisation's clients and the market value of that company and their results for that financial year. When you look at crises to do with personnel, organisations such as FIFA in the area of sport suffered crises when you looked at the governance and the processes by which that organisation made decisions for selecting locations of World Cups, etc. Deception, which is probably one of the more common examples of that, would be the scandal around car emissions that engulfed VW a year or so back. And natural crises, in fact, there's one that is related to diligence in this respect, and Hurricane Sandy, which hit in October 2012. Now, you may be thinking, well, actually, I don't remember hearing of any crises that affected diligence around Hurricane Sandy. And that's because the crisis was seen to be coming. Hurricane Sandy was well forecasted, and potentially the path that hurricane followed could have impacted one of the data centers that we had. So ahead of that event actually happening, the diligent IT organization took the decision to move and fall back to a server that was outside of the path of the hurricane itself. In actual fact, the hurricane didn't affect the original data center, but by taking that proactive action in times of crisis, any situation was avoided in advance, and so no members of the organization or any of the customers were affected by that. But that's an example of taking proactive action in times of crisis to avoid any impact on your organization or your clients. So you can think of others, I'm sure. We'll look at two in a little bit more detail. The Brexit, which it's only just over a year ago now that the vote happened. It was in June 2016. And one of the interesting factors around this is that the ICSA and Financial Times did a survey ahead of Brexit. And what they found was that only 49% of boards had actually considered the implications of a vote to leave the European Union ahead of the referendum actually taking place. And when you consider the aftermath of the vote to leave and the impact that had on things like exchange rates, etc., there were many organizations that were caught on the hop through not having considered this in advance and having a plan in place. One of the obvious examples of the outcome of Brexit was the fall in the currency rate for the pound against sterling, and that opened up a lot of organisations in the UK as attractive acquisition targets from the outside, and we've seen the aftermath of that go on and on and on. There have been other implications, most recently in the news, EasyJet's announcement that they plan to set up a separate operation based in Austria and applying for separate operations license as a result to service the European market in event of in a few years' time after the Brexit completes. And of course, as everyone I'm sure is aware, there's lots of discussion as to what form this will take, and the resulting actions from negotiations that go on, hard versus soft, etc., do have implications for the way that organizations set themselves up, the way they'll be governed, and how you respond to specific actions that are going on. So Brexit is clearly an ongoing topic that will develop over the coming years. There'll be several iterations that organizations will need to consider, and some of those will have to be considered quickly in response to events that happen. Another crisis, which you may have heard of, it hit the press about a year ago now. Barrons, the publishing company in the US, they had a crisis around a communication that went wrong. The president of Barrons received some information from Wall Street Journal, and they actually share the same parent company. It was all to do with voluntary redundancies that the Wall Street Journal were proposing at the time and the financial terms around those. The president of Barrons received the information about these redundancy terms and intended to forward that to colleagues internally about some proposed restructuring within the Barrons group themselves and what terms would be offered there. Now, unfortunately, instead of forwarding that email on, he replied to all on that email, and essentially everyone on the original source of that, which was the Wall Street Journal press room, received information that Barrons were considering these layoffs, and it was made public knowledge very quickly. So that was a sort of crisis of the own making of the company, and it sort of speaks to the communication infrastructure and how organizations are not always best placed to protect themselves from information like this being spread inadvertently. So that's an example of a crisis brought about by technology itself, and there are several others that I'm sure you can think of. So the next question is, what can you do about it? And I think fundamentally there are two aspects that need to be considered. One is what goes into a crisis management plan, and then the communications infrastructure that supports it. Now, the purpose of this webinar is not to focus so much on the crisis management planning itself, but look at more the communications that enable crises to be handled in the right way. But a few pointers on crisis management. We ran a webinar and series of events recently with a partner of ours called Housekeeping in the Middle East. And interestingly, they, when discussing this sort of issue with board members, issue a sort of 5-point questions that people need to consider to ensure that they're in the best place to handle a crisis. And so some of the things they should consider around the crisis management plan. And I'll quickly go over those 5 questions just to give you an idea of the sorts of considerations there. If anyone on the webinar is interested in seeing more of this side of the topic, then we'd be very happy to discuss that further outside of this particular session. But the questions that they were proposing that board members should consider are, firstly, is this crisis a priority? So, what may be considered a crisis initially may not turn out to be so important or have such impact, and what's the best way for an organization to react to it? Is it truly a priority for that organization? The second one is, does the board understand its role? The board's role distinct from that of the executive team. So the board will typically be setting strategy, guiding on the overall communication, while the executive team is working on the detailed activities and responses to the event itself. Does the plan account for different scenarios? That would be the third question. You may have a very well detailed plan that includes actions specific for people like the CEO or the CFO, but what happens if the CEO is indisposed? In fact, maybe as a result of the crisis itself. What are the scenarios that you have mapped out in that sort of occurrence? The fourth question they ask actually leads on to the remainder of the webinar, which is about, is the board equipped to communicate effectively amongst each other, and therefore be able to make decisions quickly in the times of crisis? And the fifth question asked is, does each board member understand their particular role in the time of crisis? So if you can go through those 5 questions and answer appropriately, then you're in a better position to be able to manage the specifics that are necessary as a result of the crisis itself. There are plenty of other structures that you can use for setting up a crisis management plan. As I say, not the main purpose of the webinar today, but we'd be more than happy to discuss our experience if anybody on the webinar would like to address that aspect further. What we will talk about a little bit more, though, is the communications infrastructure that organizations typically need to establish to support effective response during a crisis. And what you can see on this slide along the top are the sorts of attributes you need when it comes to working effectively in this sort of scenario. So in other words, need to be prepared, well informed, coordinated amongst the team, be able to take decisive action, respond quickly and effectively, must be able to do it in a secure way. And because you can't guarantee where people are going to be when a crisis occurs, needs to support mobile technologies and the fact that board members and executive members could be anywhere in the world when you need to work on this sort of topic. Often there's a mismatch between those requirements and the way that information is communicated today. So in the survey before, we saw some people are still communicating information through paper and distributing via courier, etc. A fair number of organizations are still using PDF or Word to distribute. And in those scenarios, you can't always be fast. You definitely can't always be secure. And the problems that result from that are that the executive team and the boards are not necessarily in a position to make the best informed decisions quickly and to communicate those in the right way. The difference between the sort of infrastructure you see on the left-hand side, which is either a paper distribution or an email attachment distribution, and on the right-hand side, the illustration here is that on the left-hand side, the sort of structure and communication structure that many organizations have are open to exposure because sometimes there's unencrypted aspects of that. So if you store email in a personal mail server, of which over half of typical non-exec directors do today, then you have potential for that being unencrypted, being vulnerable. Many hacks have occurred through personal email services such as Gmail or Yahoo. Some of the more well-publicized ones will be those involving people like Colin Powell. More recently, in the US, you've only got to look at email exposure from Hillary Clinton campaign last year, and most recently in the Trump administration around links with Russia, to see that email as a communication mechanism is really vulnerable, not secure. Once you have something in an email, you've lost control. It potentially could be forwarded anywhere. And on average, directors maintain multiple copies of information for their own use when this sort of structure is in place. In fact, recently, Diligent co-sponsored a white paper with the New York Stock Exchange Governance Services entitled The Price of Convenience. It was a survey of over 350 directors and the way they work when it comes to this sort of communication. And again, we'd be delighted to forward a copy on to anyone who's interested. One of the more interesting facts in that white paper was that 22% of directors who were surveyed responded saying that they do store board information, sensitive board information, in personal emails or on their own external drives, so outside the security of the organization itself. In contrast, the sort of infrastructure you see on the right-hand side, using technology such as Diligent Boards and Messenger, which we'll show to you briefly in a moment, allows you to set up a secure control perimeter around which information cannot be forwarded any further than that, and within which you have encrypted content at all times, both at rest and in transit, making the communication of that faster and more secure, which in times of crisis is vitally important. So the way that industry leaders do it, and it looks like the way that many people on this call are doing it as well, which is fantastic, is to use a system that allows the effective collaboration of information across the board, secure at all times, supporting the devices that those board members would need to use or would have around them typically. If I'm traveling, I may have an iPad with me, I may have my iPhone, whatever it happens to be, I may not have a desktop or my Windows PC with me at that point in time. So I need to get the information in a way that makes most sense to me. I also need to make sure it's secure so it can't fall into the wrong hands. I can't accidentally forward it, because if you're discussing crises or potential crises, that has to be securely contained within the group that's responsible for it. Minimize any risk of information not being seen, so minimize the risk of overlooking crucial information. We'll give you an example in a moment of how that can be done. And also, wherever people are located, if you can promote the collaboration across that team, then so much the better. And if you have technology that allows that, again, so much the better. So now what we'll do is look at a brief demonstration. And in order to do that, what I'll do is bring up a screen. And what I'll be showing is the Diligent Messenger application here. And what I have beside me on the desk is an iPhone and an iPad, and I'll be using a technology called Air Server to display that on the session here. So what I'm about to do is mirror my iPhone. So what you should be able to see now is my my iPhone. Sorry, I had to restart the Air Server there for a moment. That stopped while the webinar was going on. But what you can see are a couple of things. Firstly, that I support Chelsea Football Club, for which I make no apology whatsoever. But you also see a couple of apps on my iPhone, one of which is Diligent Messenger, and the other of which is Diligent Boards. So wherever I'm traveling, I can use the board service, but also a new service called Messenger for securely exchanging information. So if I open up the Messenger app, what you'll see here is that I've got a thread of communication that I've started around crisis management. Oops, let me just make this a little bit bigger. There we go. And at the start here, you see we have a crisis management distribution list on Messenger, and yesterday we started a topic saying we have a potential security breach. Look out for any emergency board books that are going to be distributed to you, and please only send information through the secure diligent channels. By using Messenger, we can ensure that all messages are encrypted. They only stay within this team. They can't be forwarded further to anyone outside. And we also, as an organization, can control the retention policies for those messages as well. So at the end of this particular crisis, we can choose to erase everything, or we can choose to archive it for our personal use afterwards. But and that's entirely within your control. Other messaging services, if I used iMessage or WhatsApp or things like that, then you don't have that same level of control over retention and how that information may or may not be used in future. Now you can see that as that message was sent, the top message here, I can just tap on it to see who's actually read that message. And Anderson hasn't read it yet, but both Holly and Kushal have. So it's good for me to know who's actually seen it and acting in response. And you can see that Holly has replied here saying, yeah, thanks. And she's also added an extra attachment that should be included in the board meeting notes. So if I just tap on that attachment, you can see it opens up, and I can actually look at the content that she sent through and think, yep, thanks, Holly. That's something we do want to add to for the board members to see. And I replied saying earlier on this morning, thanks, Holly. Is there anything else needed? And she's just replied this moment saying, no, not at this time. So very fast, efficient way to communicate. And in fact, she's sending me more information than I asked for there about more. She'll send more docs as she gets them. So very fast, secure way to communicate around the crisis itself, using the sorts of messaging app that people will be familiar with, and on a device that you carry all the time. You know, that was on my iPhone, for example, and in a similar way, if it were on Android or other Windows, sorry, I'm just moving the iPhone as I speak, so it changed orientation. But if it's on other platforms that you normally work with, then we support that as well. Now, that's the way that we first communicated the issue about the crisis. We said, look, you know, let's make people aware that something could be happening. We're going to set up an emergency meeting, and an emergency board pack is being prepared. Now, the way that we would normally receive that board pack is through something such as Diligent Boards. So what I'm going to do is turn off the AirPlay for this. And now I'm going to show you my iPad. So Having been notified that the crisis is potentially there and we're called an emergency board meeting, the way that I get the information about the board meeting could still be on my iPhone because there's an app for that, but diligent boards typically used on an iPad or Windows device. I can see here, I've signed in on my iPad, and you see in the center here, the crisis management meeting being called for yesterday, today, and I've got some updates available to me. So in order to get the latest information, maybe that Holly sent through, all I need to do is tap on that circular arrow, and what it will do, so it's very secure. I've been inactive for a while. I can sign back in just by using Touch ID, which I'll do there. And having done that, it will now synchronize that book. And you can see it's downloading the content of the book with the latest updates. I'll highlight two things here for you right now. There's plenty, and we have separate webinars in the series that talk about how the Diligent Board service works, but I'll highlight just a couple of things here. Firstly, it's very important at this point in time to be highlighted to information that makes a difference and maybe it's just been provided. So if I tap on this icon, the update history icon here, what I can see is that one of the updates that has been brought to our attention is the fact there's an additional briefing paper. In fact, it's the paper that I've added as a result of Holly sending it through on the Messenger app. And it's saying, please look at this updated content ahead of the meeting. Now, I can go straight to that content just by tapping there, and I can see that this is the briefing paper that Holly had passed through before. If I want to see the structure of the overall book, then I can just tap on the book itself, and using this navigation button here, it shows me the structure of this emergency meeting. So I can just tap on the left-hand side for the section I'm particularly interested in. Now I can see the agenda of the meeting here. I've got some briefing documents, including the additional paper that Holly added. As people review those, then you can make comments or you can make annotations. And one of the things that is very nice is to be able to be alerted or to be able to see which annotations have been made. In order to do that, I can just tap on the pen icon here. And I can see there's been a few annotations, and in this case, sticky notes added to this book already. If I look on page 7, for example, I'll just tap the second one on the left-hand side, and it takes me straight through to the sticky note that's referred to there. And what you'll see is this isn't just a note that's set up by me. I've started this note, and then I've asked other people to contribute. So Joe is a member of this group as well. You know, I've asked what's the international risk in relation to this potential breach. I get an answer there. I can close that. And similarly, and this is in a yellow sticky note because it was started by me. This other thread on page 3, which I tap on here. This was a thread initiated by Joe, and you can see the resulting thread of information there. So very simple, very quick to get the information through, very fast to make comments and share those comments with others so that you can collaborate effectively. And the final thing I'll show as part of this process is the fact that if we need to make any decisions and need to sign off on things, so for example, resolutions or signing off on actions, if I tap on this tick box here, then what I can do is look at any items that need my sign-off, so any resolutions that require sign-off. And you see there's an action plan and a couple of resolutions where my signature is needed to show that I've participated where appropriate or I agree with a particular course of action. So I'll just select the middle one here. And this is a very simple voting form. And in order to cast my vote and say, yes, I approve of this action, I just tap where it says tap to cast vote. And I can choose to vote for, against, or abstain on that issue. I'll vote for in this case. I have to confirm that. And what it will do is put my signature there and also timestamp when that's been done. So I could be anywhere in the world. I've downloaded the latest content. I've made some collaborative comments with other members of the crisis management team and made a decision on the process that we follow and sign off on that decision there and then. One other quick thing I'll show you just as a way of illustrating how you can control the structure of the communications system here, and how you can make it a closed loop system. In other words, I can't send information out beyond this particular environment. I'm going to switch to the Windows app now. So I've been showing the iPad app so far. Now I'm going to sign in as another member of the team. This is Joe's sign in. And now I'm seeing exactly the same sort of information, but just in a Windows environment. So we've seen the iPad before, now we see the Windows. And here is the crisis management book in the middle there. And if I can just, if I just tap and open on that, it will open up the same content. And if I look at annotations, I can see exactly the same annotations that we were looking at before, only the other way around, because I'm signed in as Joe here, and so Joe initiated some of these comments. The thing I want to show here in particular, though, is at the bottom, these are the options where normally, if you allow people, you can export or you can print content. Now, because this committee is hugely sensitive, for this particular committee, we've said no one is allowed to print or email any annotations or any aspects of the book out. There's just not the option to do that. In contrast, we may decide that for other committees, such as this audit one, for example, if I open this book up, and in this case, I may have some annotations, etc., you'll see at the bottom here, I do have the option to export those annotations as an email or print that particular page of the book. And so in this case, I'm allowing this particular user to go ahead and take some of that content and forward it on, either as a printed document, although you see it there with a watermark, or as an email of some of the annotations. Whereas the more highly sensitive committee, that option isn't there. So you protect people from the sort of mistake that we've seen made in other environments. Okay, I'll go back briefly to the presentation. And we'll wrap up just with a brief mention of diligence as an organization. We've been involved in many systems across nearly 5,000 clients now and over 140,000 users, where this communication of board and executive level information has to be done in the most secure and efficient way. You see some of the statistics here about our organization as to where we're based, where we operate. The statistic that we're probably most proud of, though, is the fact that over 99% of clients who work with us choose to continue to work with us in subsequent years. We offer our service in software as a service mode, which essentially means that people can choose to continue their subscription every year, or they can go elsewhere if they choose. And we're delighted to say that over 99% of organizations choose to stay with us and continue to work with us. That's all I wish to say as part of the webinar so far. I appreciate we're just a little bit over time, so apologies for that. But hopefully you've seen some examples of crises, crisis management, the importance of communications infrastructure as part of that, and then a brief demonstration of some of the technologies that you can use to ensure that this information is securely and effectively communicated to allow your executives to make decisions in the right way, in the right time, in times of crisis. I'll stop there. Holly, I'll hand back to you and thank everyone for their attention.
Thank you, Nathan. Apologies for running a few minutes over, everybody. We have had a couple of interesting questions come through, but in the interest of time, we will come back to you over email on those. If you would like any further information on anything to do with crisis management or board portals in general, or the messenger service, then by all means, please visit our website, diligent.com, or you'll see an email address there, info@diligent.com. Feel free to contact us there. On our website also, you'll see lots of white papers on board portal adoption and case studies from our existing customers. Thank you very much once again for joining us today. On behalf of Nathan and myself, we hope you have a wonderful day and see you next time. Thank you very much.